In the first week of May 2014, bartenders across the United States started running out of limes, not because nobody wanted them, because the price of a single 38-pound case had jumped from around $20 to more than $100 in a matter of months. Restaurants pulled lime wedges off their Cinco de Mayo menus entirely. Some swapped in lemons and hoped nobody would notice. Margaritas went out with an apology attached, and 1,000 miles south, in the hills of Michoacan, Mexico, farmers were walking away from entire orchards, not because the trees had stopped bearing fruit, but because armed men were showing up at the gate, demanding a cut of every harvest. This was not a bad growing season. This was a drug cartel deciding it wanted a piece of the lime business, and it would not be the last time. But to understand how a fruit small enough to fit in your palm ended up bankrolling gunmen, wrecking a chunk of the British Navy, and giving an entire nationality its nickname, you have to go back a very long way. Long before there were countries, or navies, or cartels, there was a patch of humid jungle somewhere in the Indo-Malayan region of Southeast Asia, probably near the border of what is now India, Myanmar, and southern China. This is where citrus itself began, tens of thousands of years before agriculture existed anywhere. Wild citron trees and a spiny, bitter little relative called micrantha grew side by side, and at some point, entirely without human help, their flowers crossed. The result was a small, intensely sour, thin-skinned fruit that botanists would eventually name Citrus aurantifolia. Humans did not invent the lime. Nature did that quietly, on its own, in a rainforest nobody was watching. Humans just found it, picked it up, and started carrying it around. Not every branch of that family tree turned out sour either. A nearly sweet, almost acid-free cousin called the sweet lime is still eaten out of hand across South Asia and the Mediterranean today, proof that even this small genus has its outliers. But it was the sour version that was about to travel. Over the following centuries, the lime moved out of Southeast Asia along ancient trade routes into India, then into Persia and the Arab world. Arab and Persian traders were the ones who really pushed citrus westward, planting orchards across the Middle East and North Africa. Between roughly the 9th and 13th centuries, agronomists writing in Arabic produced detailed manuals on citrus cultivation, grafting techniques, and irrigation, and planted lime trees as far west as the orchards of Muslim Spain, centuries before most of Europe had ever tasted one. The Persian word for the fruit was limu, and when European crusaders reached the Levant in the 11th and 12th centuries, they found orchards full of these small green fruits and carried both the trees and the word home. That single root, limu, eventually split into two different English words, lemon and lime, for two different fruits that people would spend the next several centuries mixing up. The confusion never really went away. In French, a lime is still called citron vert, literally green lemon. Across much of Latin America, the word limon is used for both fruits, while in Spain the same word usually just means lemon. 800 years later, a huge share of the planet still cannot agree on where one fruit ends and the other begins. That confusion, it turns out, was eventually going to get people killed. By the late 1400s, limes had been growing around the Mediterranean for generations. Then, Christopher Columbus crossed the Atlantic, and on his second voyage in 1493, he carried citrus seeds, limes among them, to the Caribbean. The climate was perfect. Limes went half wild almost immediately, naturalizing across the islands and up through Mexico as Spanish colonization spread. Around 1838, the trees reached a chain of small limestone islands off the tip of Florida that fishermen and shipwreck salvagers had started calling the Keys. Nobody planted them there on any grand plan. They just grew, thorny and stubborn in people's yards, producing a small yellow-green fruit that would eventually give the region its most famous dessert. But that story comes later. First, the lime had a war to help fight. For most of the age of sail, the deadliest thing a sailor faced was not a storm, not an enemy warship. It was his own gums. Scurvy killed an estimated 2 million sailors between the 1500s and the 1700s, more than combat, more than shipwreck, more than every naval battle of the era combined. It started with fatigue and joint pain. It ended with bleeding gums, teeth falling out, old wounds tearing back open, and death. Nobody knew why it happened. Captains blamed bad air, bad water, moral weakness. In 1747, a Scottish naval surgeon named James Lind decided to actually test it. Aboard HMS Salisbury, he split 12 sick sailors into 6 pairs and gave each pair a different remedy: vinegar, seawater, cider, a diluted sulfuric acid tonic, and, for one lucky pair, 2 oranges and a lemon. Within a week, the citrus pair was fit for duty again. It was one of the first controlled clinical trials in medical history. Captain James Cook, experimenting with anti-scurvy diets on his own long Pacific voyages in the 1770s, lost barely a man to the disease across 3 separate expeditions, proof, even before it became official policy, that the disease was entirely preventable. And still, it took the British Admiralty 42 years to act on Lind's findings. So why the delay on a fix that had already been proven? Mostly bureaucracy and the staggering logistical cost of provisioning an entire navy with fresh fruit. Finally, in 1795, the Royal Navy began issuing a daily ration of lemon juice to every sailor on long voyages. The results were almost immediate. Scurvy, the single largest killer of British sailors for 2 centuries, all but disappeared from the fleet. It should have ended there. It did not. By 1804, Britain was at war with Spain, and Spain happened to grow most of Europe's lemons. The Navy needed roughly 50,000 gallons of citrus juice a year and could no longer buy it from an enemy nation, so the Admiralty switched to a fruit it could get from its own colonies in the British Caribbean instead. Limes. Cheaper, patriotic, available. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. Limes contain roughly half the vitamin C of lemons, and nobody at the time knew vitamin C existed, let alone that it was the actual reason any of this worked. American sailors, watching their British counterparts down their daily ration, started calling them lime juicers, a jab that got sanded down over the decades into a single word: limeys. The nickname stuck to British sailors, then the British Navy, then eventually to British people in general, and people still use it today, usually without knowing it began as a joke about a nutritional downgrade, because that is exactly what it was. Scurvy crept quietly back into long British voyages over the following century, turning up on polar expeditions and merchant runs, and almost nobody connected the dots for decades, partly because the Navy's method of preparing the juice, boiling it down in open copper kettles for storage, destroyed most of whatever vitamin C the limes had left to begin with. It was not until the early 1930s that scientists finally isolated vitamin C and proved, once and for all, that a switch made in 1804 for reasons of wartime convenience had quietly cost lives for well over a century. But the daily lime ration did produce one genuinely useful invention. In 1867, a Scottish ship supplier named Lochlin Rose, working out of the port of Leith near Edinburgh, patented a way to preserve lime juice with sugar and a touch of sulfur dioxide instead of the rum or brandy that most preserved citrus juice had relied on until then. That same year, Parliament passed the Merchant Shipping Act, making a daily citrus ration legally mandatory on every British merchant vessel, not just naval ones. Rose's timing could not have been better. His product, sold as Rose's lime juice cordial, became the world's first commercially produced fruit concentrate, a sweetened, shelf-stable syrup that outlived the age of sale entirely. Bartenders eventually discovered it mixed beautifully with gin, and the gimlet cocktail was born not long after. The company changed hands for the next century and a half through Schweppes, then Cadbury, then the Dr. Pepper Snapple Group, and the bottles are still sitting on bar shelves today, a direct commercial descendant of a 19th century scurvy regulation. Back in Florida, the small thorny limes growing wild in the Keys had quietly become a local specialty. Sometime after 1859, when Gail Borden's canned sweetened condensed milk started showing up in general stores, someone in the Keys, nobody knows exactly who, combined it with egg yolks and the intensely tart local lime juice, and key lime pie was born. By the early 1900s, it was a regional cash crop, marketed as an exotic Florida delicacy, with small commercial groves shipping crates of key limes as far as Texas and the Carolinas. Then, on September 18, 1926, a Category 4 hurricane tore through Miami and the Keys with 150-mile-an-hour winds, killing hundreds of people and flattening the region's citrus groves in a single night. Growers looked at the wreckage and made a choice. Instead of replanting the small, seedy, thin-skinned key lime, most planted something sturdier, the Persian lime, a larger, seedless hybrid, itself a cross between the key lime and the lemon, that had already been growing quietly in California and South Florida for decades without much commercial attention. It seemed like the practical call. It ended up rewriting which lime an entire country would grow up thinking of as normal. Within a generation, the Persian lime, not the key lime, became the fruit most Americans simply called lime. Real key limes turned into a specialty item, something you had to seek out, even in Florida, even at the restaurants that put the word authentic on the menu. To this day, most bags labeled key lime in American supermarkets are not actually key limes at all. They are ordinary small Persian limes, sold under a name that survived long after the fruit itself had quietly changed underneath it. The Persian lime's reign in Florida did not last either. In August of 1992, Hurricane Andrew, one of the most destructive storms in American history, tore through South Miami-Dade County and wiped out roughly 70% of the state's remaining lime acreage in a single pass. Before the groves could recover, the North American Free Trade Agreement took effect in 1994, opening the door to cheaper Mexican limes and undercutting what was left of the Florida industry on price. Then came citrus canker, a bacterial disease that swept through South Florida starting in 1995, forcing the destruction of still more trees under state eradication orders. By the early 2000s, commercial lime farming in Florida had essentially ceased to exist. Today, if you buy a key lime pie in Key West, the limes inside it were almost certainly grown 2,000 miles away, in Mexico, and that is where nearly all of the world's limes come from now. Mexico produces roughly 3 million tons of limes a year and exports more of them than any other country on Earth, shipping close to 800,000 tons annually, with well over 90% of every lime eaten in the United States arriving from a handful of Mexican states, chiefly Veracruz and Michoacan, which together grow more than half the country's entire crop. Within Michoacan, a hot, dry inland region called Tierra Caliente accounts for the vast majority of the state's harvest. It is some of the most productive citrus land on the planet. It is also, unfortunately, some of the most dangerous. This is where the story catches back up to that Cinco de Mayo in 2014. Organized crime groups in Michoacan, most notably the Knights Templar cartel, had realized as early as 2011 that limes were not just a fruit. They were a captive export market worth taxing. Growers and packers were told to pay a percentage of every shipment or watch their orchards burn. Some paid. Some refused and lost everything anyway. A former lime farmer named Hipólito Mora organized a citizen self-defense militia in 2013 and helped drive the Knights Templar out of parts of the region, becoming something of a folk hero in the process. But the vacuum the Knights Templar left behind did not stay empty for long. By 2024, two new criminal factions, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel and a rival coalition known as the United Cartels, were fighting over the same territory, using the same tactic: control the harvest, dictate the price, tax the farmers, and burn the orchards of anyone who refuses. Mexican government data showed lime prices climbing more than 235% between early 2021 and late 2023 alone. In June of 2024, Hipólito Mora, the same lime farmer who had once driven the cartels out, was shot and killed by gunmen near his hometown. It is the same region, the same criminal economy, and very nearly the same story that has made headlines about Michoacan's avocado industry for years, because more often than not, it is the same cartels running both rackets at once. And underneath the human violence, a second, quieter threat has been spreading through the same orchards. A bacterial disease called citrus greening, carried by a tiny insect, has already gutted Florida's orange industry, has no cure, and has been turning up in citrus regions across Mexico as well. Mexico's lime supply, already squeezed by extortion, is now also racing against an epidemic nobody can see. And yet, somehow, none of it has slowed the lime down. It is still everywhere. It is squeezed over tacos and folded into guacamole in the very country now growing nearly all of it. It flavors pho and papaya salad and pad thai across Southeast Asia, the region where the whole story started 9,000 years ago. It is pickled with mustard oil and chili in Indian kitchens, and it garnishes gin and tonics from London to Lagos, still, technically, doing the same anti-scorbutic job the Royal Navy assigned it back in 1795. It is also, somehow, the entire reason the margarita exists, a drink whose true birthplace is still disputed, claimed at various times by bartenders in Tijuana, Ciudad Juarez, and Acapulco, sometime around the 1930s or 40s, none of it provable, all of it beside the point, because without lime there is no drink to argue about in the first place. There is even a medical condition named after it. Doctors call it phytophotodermatitis. Everyone else calls it margarita burn. Lime peel contains light-sensitizing compounds called furanocoumarins, and if the juice gets on your skin, and that skin then sees direct sunlight, you can end up with a red, blistering rash a day or two later, often in streaks or drip patterns that have occasionally been mistaken for abuse, or chemical burns in emergency rooms. Bartenders get it. So do kids squeezing limes by the pool. It is, quite literally, a chemical burn from garnishing your own drink. Key lime pie was named Florida's official state pie in 2006, more than 80 years after the hurricane that supposedly ended the key lime's American career. Lime oil scents soap and cleaning products. A green and gold bottle of lime cordial still sits on bar shelves, a direct descendant of a Scottish ship chandler's 1867 patent. It sweetens sodas, sours cocktails, and seasons everything from ceviche to street corn. A fruit that has never once, in 9,000 years, actually managed to be ignored. So think about what this small, sour, unglamorous fruit has actually done. It quietly rode out the age of sail and gave an entire nation its nickname, for the wrong reason, using the wrong citrus, for well over a century. It funded one of the very first commercial beverage companies in modern history. It survived 2 hurricanes only to lose its home continent to trade policy instead. And today, a fruit that costs a few pesos at a roadside stand in Michoacan is valuable enough that armed men are willing to fight over who gets to tax it. 9,000 years ago, nobody planted this thing on purpose. It just grew, in a jungle nobody was watching, and it has been quietly running parts of the world ever since. If this story changed the way you look at the wedge sitting on the rim of your glass, hit subscribe, drop a like, and tell us in the comments which everyday fruit or vegetable you want us to dig into next.